Assalamu alaikum. We have been looking at William Wordsworth for the past couple of videos, and we have seen mainly his criticism, also a little bit about his poetry. We discussed his poetry in relation to his criticism. So we saw the poet, his language, the way he language used manipulated his language to create beautiful poetry, and how he experimented with a new form of poetry in terms of the subject chosen in the choice of his words and in his approach to those subjects, all of it, right? So in a way, it was reinforced to us that the various theories and concepts of the writer have been made um, to emphasize the incidents of common life, the primary laws of human nature, and the low and rustic life, and also the language of rustic people. So, the preface of 1800 is most remembered by what may be regarded as a paradox. The paradox we spoke of, there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. This we have already spoken plenty of times. I hope and believe that you would remember this main important a paradox that Wordsworth goes about setting up. So we saw how he seems to have been dragged into criticism in spite of himself, mainly because his lyrical ballads was attacked by the neoclassical writers, and in defense, he seems to have offered a kind of apology initially, saying that I was just experimenting with this new form. And despite his apology, people kept attacking him. The neoclassical writers kept attacking him for his poor choice of words or poor choice of subject and all of that, and for lowering the esteem of poetry. Anyway, we saw a little bit about a romantic movement as to how it began with Rousseau and in Europe, and how it spread across the seas, all over the world, to England, to America, to and just about everywhere, and and its impact, the various forms of romanticism, because romantic movement would imply, it would not mean that it was just one kind of attitude or one idea. It was a multiple, a series of interpretations, right? From various artists and writers and philosophers and thinkers. They all perceive romanticism differently. So what we now call romanticism is an array of different uh, uh, streams of thought, but the core remains essential. It focuses on sentimentality, a little bit on sentiment, on emotion, on nature, and innocence, the childhood innocence. Yes. So we saw how the romantic movement affected thinkers all over the world, and its terminology, who had coined it and all that. And we saw some key figures responsible for the romantic movement in France and in German and in Britain. And with his poems, basically, a few of his very important poems, the Immortality Ode, Tintin Abbey, Solitary Reaper, very few of his poems we've mentioned here. We saw a little bit about his poetic style. And what we find is that in some, he follows his rules, his own principles as to the choice of subject or the poetic diction. But in the rest, mostly, he does make use prodigiously of all the poetic devices that he accused neoclassical writers of using excessively. Okay, so while the neoclassical writers used those devices excessively, he only used them like moderately where it was required, judiciously. Okay, see, there is a difference. You can see, if you add too much of spices to your food, whatever you're making, you're cooking, it it would it is quite possible it would become gross at some point, right? You have to use it judiciously. Only if only a pinch is required, a pinch should suffice, right? I don't know how well that analogy worked, but the point remains. Anyway, so we saw a little bit about his critical works, and with special reference to his lyrical ballads and neoclassical poetic diction. See, the question of poetic diction or the language fit for poetry chiefly compelled Wordsworth to write his preface. So that is the main reason why we look into the neoclassical poetic diction, and we saw the various kinds of language, how writers of the classical writers divided language into three categories, not language but language styles, how language is used. Like, it gives you a certain style, right? Each one of us has a certain style. I mean, the way we dress, the way we speak, the way we interact, or the way we make something or create something, we all have certain style. We are basically doing what everyone else does, but we each of us have a distinctive way of doing it, right? So I too am cooking the same thing, you two are cooking the same thing. So my biryani would be different from yours. Why? Because I have my own style and you have yours, even though the ingredients remain the same. The same way, uh, the writers, the poets, they all are writing in the same language. All poets who are writing in the same language, they are making use of the same kind of syntactic structure, or they are making use of the same the grammatic structure, or the meters or rhymes or rhythms, or all of the poetic devices. But it is in the way they manipulate those devices, those structures, those functional parts of the language, which makes their style distinct from others. So they have their own styles. So basically, there are all kinds of style, and these styles are not consciously done most of the time. Okay, so it comes through learning, or the lack thereof. Either way, it depends on a person's experience, or with that particular medium, right? So the style is divided, has been divided in various forms, into various categories by writers of the classical writers. And also, there is an analysis or observation of how writers of the restoration period, or the neoclassical age, how they wrote. Well, restoration is a part of neoclassical period. uh, anyway, so we saw a little bit about how they have created a separate kind of vocabulary, or restricted a certain kind of vocabulary for poetry, for writing poetry. And this was very, very lofty. They dispensed away with all the technical terms and all the technical, all the mediocre words, or the not so refined uh, form of syntax. Yeah. So they dispensed away with all of these, and what was left was very high, complicated poetic diction, and along with it, a certain artificiality creeped into their writing. So Wordsworth was mainly against it. Initially, he did not voluntarily, take up a battle against it. It's just that he experimented a kind of poetry that would be devoid of these artifice. Okay, and during this experimentation, which was attacked, he had to, what was merely an experiment, turned into a conviction. Okay, so initially it was merely an experiment, but then in the later revisions, what we find, or revisions of his preface, what we find that he is quite convinced of his stance. Okay, of his stance, as in his standing, that okay, fine, this is what I claim to do, this is what I intended to do, rather than the earlier claim that he was just experimenting, he was merely experimenting. So we saw how the classical poetic diction was mostly verbose, and Wordsworth pleaded for a retention of common speech in poetry, and the principal object was to choose incidents and situations from common life in a selection of language really used by men. And yes, as I said, the paradox, it was in no respect to different from good prose, and could be only distinctive because of its meter. So he asked for a simpler diction, and the diction of day that would privilege language of men against personification and poetic diction. Uh, and yes, so he speaks of a lofty language, but still a language that is tempered. Okay. Coming to today's concept of what language of poetry is, to him, poetry was, I believe we've already done this, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. We spoke of how feelings were erupted suddenly, and but then this sudden emotion, this sudden overflow of feelings is curbed, or is channeled deliberately through emotion, right? Emotion that is emotion recollected in tranquility, so it is tranquilized to some extent, so that what we find is a pure form of feeling that is that could be molded into to convey the feeling without resorting to hyperboles and exaggerations, right? So it is true of second words. He also speaks of how second words as of second thoughts are best, as in how, when you think for the first time, I mean, if when someone asks you a question, your immediate response may not be the right response. When you give it a thought, you might actually come up with a proper solution, of a good answer, really good answer that suits both of you, right? The same way, words, the choice of words also is better when it is thought twice. It is better to think twice rather than brushly. Commit your emotion to substandard writing, substandard form of writing. So, as far as function of poetry was concerned, it stands or falls by its effect on reader. So, it is the reader, how he perceives, that matters. And because poetry, writing poetry is not an individual, practice. It is something that relates to another person. So, of all, the main function of poetry is to give pleasure and moral gain. Okay, so the aesthetic appeal is brought about by all of these: meter, rhyme, expression. All of it contribute to bringing out the pleasure, giving the aesthetic appeal. Whereas the subject, he believes, should be man, nature, human life. He not merely points out what subjects to choose, he also tells you how to choose it, what approach to make. So on the aesthetic level, it has to be, meter, rhyme, expression has to be taken care of. But at the core, it has to relate to truth, grandeur, beauty, and love and hope. So who's a poet? A poet is someone who has great power to feel and has access, ready access to reader's heart. How would a poet have access to read anyone's heart? Only when he empathizes with someone, empathizes with the common man. So unless you can relate to some deep emotion in every individual, every human being, you won't be able to write poetry that is appreciated by everyone, right? So what you write has to mean something to someone at some point. Otherwise, that poetry would fall flat. Again, the purpose of poetry is to pursue truth, to perceive truth, to look for truth. And how would you arrive at truth? When you relate to God, nature, and man, right? So the poetry is a major part of our existence, mainly because we get to look at ourselves and understand our deficiencies and try to overcome them. A science too looks for answers because it is always in the quest for searching for truth, right? But it is purely material. It's at a physical level, whereas poetry is at a metaphysical level and the subconscious level, and hence transcendental. So poetry is therefore breath and finer spirit of all knowledge. Hence poetry is the core, the essence of all knowledge. It is the impassioned expression which is the countenance of all science, to console the afflicted. So see the job of poetry. Yes, the science would give you all sorts of antibiotics to overcome it, to get away from the fever that's raining. But it is poetry that consoles the afflicted. It is the beauty of poetry that consoles the afflicted, that adds sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier, to teach the young and the gracious of every age to see, to think and feel, and therefore to become more actively and securely virtuous. See, some when you are really down, you know, you get all these WhatsApp messages. You have something that tells you not to lose heart, or sometimes when you are really not sure of yourself, you get something that boosts your confidence, right? These are all poetry. It is nothing but poetry. All those adages, just because they don't take poetic form, it does not mean they're not. Poetry is something that beautifully relates some truth to you. For instance, see, one of my favorite poems by Robert Browning, Rabbi Ben Ezra. It was not, see, it's something that always reverberates in my mind. No, especially a few of, few of the lines, some of the lines of the poem. See, it says something like this: "What I aspired to be and was not comforts me. A brute I might have been, but would not sink in the scale. What is he but a brute whose flesh has soul to suit, whose spirit works lest arms and legs won't play? To man propose this test, thy body at its best. How far can that project thy soul on its lone way?" And then he goes on to say how, every gift should prove their use, and on every aspect of whatever we have received has to have some use. Every gift that has been bestowed upon us by God has to have some use. It's a beautiful poetry. I mean, there's this one point where the poem tells about how insignificant we are in our own eyes, in the eyes of our fellow beings. And then he speaks of, those lines would be better one sec. "But all the world's coarse thumb and finger failed to plumb, so passed in making up the main account, all instinct immature, all purposes unsure, that weighed not as his work, yet swelled the man's account." See, it is so, funny that it should strike right at the root of our being. Yeah, thoughts hardly to be packed into a narrow act, fancies that broke through language and escaped. All I could never be. Please listen to this closely. All I could never be, all men ignored in me, this I was worth to God, whose wheel the pitcher shaped. Fantastic, fantastic lines. I don't know. I um, I mean, it's not just me. I believe it would affect anyone who reads it, because it seems to uh, you know give you the necessary sustenance to reconnect to yourself, to reconnect to God, right? Okay, forget the man behind him. Browning, I know he doesn't have a very great reputation for his personal life or his personal convictions, but uh, but uh, from where from the poetic point of view, it is fantastic. All right. So we were talking about the poet. The poet is a man speaking to men. See, Robert Browning is speaking to us from over 100 200 years back, right? He rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him. And to him, a poet is a uncommon man. So to Wordsworth, poetry is an uncommon man. Remember this. He's an uncommon man, superior to common folk, but he uses, you know, common subjects, common words, something that would appeal to common man. So he does not speak as a lawyer, a physician, or a mariner, or an astronomer, or a philosopher, but as a man. Yes, even though the narrator would come across, say for instance, there are so many poems in which the narrator, I'm not talking about the poet and the narrator are two different beings, right? The poet is someone who writes poetry. The narrator would be someone who is part of the poetry, where it is a character who's a character in the poetry, right? So the narrator could be just about anyone. He could be a lawyer, physician, a mariner, an astronomer. And there have been poems where I have seen even um, sea drivers, or or voyagers, or mm, there are so many. There are all kinds of narrators in poetry. So a poet would be speaking not as any of these, but as a man speaking to man, because you would not be appealing to the superficial acts of our being. You would not be appealing to the everyday chores that we busy ourselves in, or to the interactions we indulge in every day, or the pleasures we indulge in every day. It would be something that touches our heart, to the core of our being, not merely heart, but to the core of our being. So, metrical composition, meter, according to Wordsworth, elevates the mind to higher consciousness, creating aesthetic distance. See, an aesthetic distance would be what is brings about, the aesthetic appeal. This distance is necessary, because otherwise, what would happen is just, you know, uh, enthusiastic expressions of excited emotions. Nothing more than that. Those words would not be long lasting in its effect. For a momentary time, for a very small moment, yes, it may have a major impact, but otherwise, it would not stand the test of time. So it tempers and restrains passions. See, passion is nothing but um, strong feelings, very, very strong feelings. I don't know what the dictionary meaning is, but I believe passions are nothing but strong feelings. So, writers, poets basically feel very strongly, right? All of us feel strongly. We just don't have the adequate expression to go with the feelings. I mean, when we are just happy, we just say "hey," or we are sad, we just like "oh." That's the amount of our expressions, right? But the poets have been gifted with expression. They've learned how to express, so they can channel the passions they feel through expressions, through poetry. Okay, but what Wordsworth feels is that passion is a necessary requirement for writing good poetry, but passion alone would not suffice. It has to be tempered by, you know, meter. Okay, it has to have a proper meter. Any kind of meter, iambic, tricky, or whatever. He remember that Shakespeare sonnet? Uh, it goes something like this: Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to come thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. See, this poetry, this sonnet of Shakespeare's, could actually border on being trite, and or border on over exaggeration. But mainly because of the meter, the rhyme scheme in it, or the meter in it, more than the rhyme scheme. It is what makes it balanced. It is what makes it acceptable to some extent. Not some extent, it is quite popular. This particular sonnet is very, very popular. Um, so see, the passion is there. The core of this poetry is passion. Okay, it is a very passionate declaration, but it is tempered by meter. So earlier poets wrote with passion, and the latter poets imitated them without any. So what Wordsworth says is that initially every poet had some passion in him, felt very strongly, and those feelings were communicated through their poetry. But later poets, they simply copied their predecessors instead of creating any genuine poetry. So what they did was they relied largely on intelligence, their own wit. Okay, their own wit they relied on, and this dependence on wit took away a bit and reason. Yeah, they were very reasonable. So reason, more often than not, goes in contradiction to feelings and emotions. So this reason seems to have taken away the genuineness, the integrity of an honest work, okay, or honest feelings, you could say. So when someone writes about say a loss in elegy, okay, that elegy would turn so contrite. It would be so seem so artificial. Say for instance in the what was that, Milton's work. Speaking of see Lycidas, yeah, that elegy was Lycidas. Says, T.S. Eliot has something, not something, quite a bit to talk uh, about the artificiality of Milton's writing. See, at one point he says that, um, yeah, this novelty has been, that is, in terms of the kind of language Milton used, this novelty has been, say those who can find nothing wrong with Milton, imputed to his laborious endeavors, afterwards suited to the grandeur of his ideas. See, Edison believes that, their language sunk under him. That is, Milton used a very lofty, high language that which the others, his contemporaries, could not keep up with. But Eliot says, but the truth is that both in prose and in verse he formed his style by a perverse and pedantic principle. He was desirous to use English words with a foreign idiom. This in all his prose is discovered and condemned, for their judgment operates freely, neither softened by the beauty nor awed by the dignity of his thoughts. See, in his elegy Lycidas, while it is mourning the death of a friend, yeah, see what it says. I don't know. It is turning out into a diatribe on Milton. That was not my intent. I'm just trying to tell you that the passions should be. I mean, the poetry should be born of the passions. Okay, poetry should be born out of true, genuine feelings. It should not be. And when you indulge too much into the technicalities, technicalities as in the techniques and tricks that would bring about a very high image of those feelings, you are stealing away, you're taking away from its genuineness. Okay, so that was a point I was trying to make. Anyway, as far as the validity of his theories is concerned, Coleridge questions the validity of Wordsworth's theories because, as we have already spoken plenty of times, that Wordsworth himself did not follow his own rules. And Coleridge asks, when the selection is removed, okay, when the selection is removed, the rustic language is greatly impoverished. Coleridge says that when there is, Wordsworth tells you to make use of a selection of language used by common men, right? So Coleridge is asking, what is the selection you're talking about? And if you remove the selection, as in like choice words, choice phrases, choice, interactions of common people. Of see, for instance, there are a couple of farmers or pastor of a village. They're talking. So when they speak, what you find is there is a difference. Okay, the pastor speaks in a different style, and the farmer has his own, common lingo. Now, there is going to be, I mean, each of them are going to understand the other, but what happens is they are going to have very different styles. Now, Wordsworth wants you to choose the kind of style that is select, that is the best among those, okay, best among the ones that is used or used in a rustic situation, okay, in a rustic setting. So what you would use is that when you remove the selection, when the selection is removed, the rustic language will be really poor. I mean, it wouldn't be rich. The poetry would be very poor. There is nothing special about people living in close proximity with nature. Come on, I have been living with those people because, yes, as I said, as I've mentioned already, Wordsworth and Coleridge lived together for some time. Lived together in the sense, lived in close vicinity. okay, in the same neighborhood for some time. So Coleridge too is familiar with the rustic setting, with the you know with the people living in the rural area. So he says there is nothing very special about it. He's not using any derogatory term here to indicate that they are beneath those living, in the city. It's not that. What he's saying is they too are just the same as us, okay, us common people. So Coleridge pointed out that what he says, Coleridge insists is that education is essential. So the people living in the rural area, we're not talking about the current day rural Britain or current day rural India. We're talking about rural Britain some 200 years ago. Okay, so those people did not have any education, and their speech reflected this lack. So you need to have the language, use the language that is refined. Education gives you that refinement. The essential requirement of poetry is a refined speech, even if not lofty speech, right? So, yeah. His preface to lyrical ballads is considered as a manifesto. Please do remember this. It is considered as manifesto of British Romantic movement, because Romantic movement was already in existence. It was going hi-fi, with all the French Revolution being fought there in France, in Europe. All the whole entire Europe was in turmoil because of the Romantic movement, which wasn't called Romantic movement at that particular point. Please make note of this. Okay, while it was going on, it was not called the Romantic movement. It was only later coinage. Okay, now what happened in Britain was a very slow on process, which was skyrocketed by lyrical ballads. Okay, by especially the preface to lyrical ballads. So that is why it is considered as the manifesto of the Romantic movement. Okay, and we've already spoken about how he dismissed personification, pathetic fallacy, and all the poetic devices, but he employed them to great effect, mainly because he used them in moderation. That's the beauty of Wordsworth's poetry. So you cannot completely disclaim, it would be unfair to say that Wordsworth did not follow any of his principles himself. He did follow them, but only in moderation. So please bear that in mind. Again, Wordsworth had certain charges against Coleridge. He asked, he questioned Coleridge's definition of fancy and imagination. And as in, Coleridge had made this assertion that fancy was an associative power and imagination was a shaping or modifying power. So he says it is abstract, it's unclear. Please make it clear. Because you have to also understand that any theory we are dealing with today, except for a few, maybe except for the Marxist or the feminist, or a little bit on eco criticism, except for those, most of the theories are purely hypothetical. But we spend time on them, we learn them, we try to understand them to get a better understanding of literature. All right. So, but it is nevertheless, despite its abstractness, it is nevertheless very rewarding, highly rewarding to ponder upon. Okay. So, in conclusion, Wordsworth's main success lies in the shift in emphasis from relationship between poem and reader to poem and poet. So, we saw the creative aspect of poetry. So, instead of merely focusing on the effect the poem had on a person reading, we saw how Wordsworth was concerned with poetic creation, how it should be created, what are the components required to create good poetry, what kind of language should we use. Okay, I am going repetitive here, so we'll stop here. So finally he says, raised the famous question as to what is poetry is the same as what is poet. So poetry is nothing but a reflection of poet's inner soul. Okay, thank you so much for your patient listening. Stay safe, be happy. Assalamu alaikum.